From 2002 to 2019 we lived in this small half-timbered house that I had restored in the years before. When we moved out, I was able to make some videos about the house, which I can use now for a general overview of the restoration and its result. I will start here with a review of the first steps. I bought the house in 1999 because I thought it was nice and well proportioned and it wasn't too expensive. I had little idea what I was getting myself into, but that's always the case. It takes time to understand that the path to your own restoration success inevitably has to be bought with a considerable amount of work. The front door led from the garden into a hallway with a small toilet. Both were located in an extension to the originally smaller house. From there you came into the original hallway, from which you could go to the kitchen and the living room as usual. The kitchen has only 7 square meters, further reduced by the chimney in the corner. The living room next to it has at least 11 square meters and 2 large windows on 2 sides. Later we even found a walled-up 3rd window. The condition of the upper floor was even older. The last renovation took place here around 1900. The lamp here at eye level is probably Art Nouveau. The ceiling height is 1.75 meters. All interior walls were still preserved and changed as pure timber frame wall with wattle and clay. The stairs into the attic had once been replaced by a modern attic ladder. There in the attic was a simple chamber facing towards the gable facade. It was nicely plastered and painted inside. You could even see where a bed and a stove had been there. The lime paint on the wall was worn away where the cushions on the bed rubbed against it. Remnants of seaweed were an indication of what mattresses were usually made of at that time. From the garden you could not only get into the house, but also on the right side of the front door into a separate part. This room was used to store firewood. From there you could also use a ladder to climb into the attic of the extension of the house, where all sorts of junk were still lying around. From here you could also see very nicely how the new parts had been attached to the old house. The small windows of the former outer wall that were still preserved here revealed how these windows openings had once been designed all around. The only basement room in the house is located below here. Since the basement protrudes 50 centimeters from the ground, the floor of the room above is higher than the rest of the ground floor. The basement was made in a very simple way with an extremely thin ceiling, and it is just 1.75 meters high. But at least there was a water connection here which supplied the toilet flush and the only tap in the kitchen. There was no bathroom. They bathed once a month in the tin tub in the garden. It seemed as if one could at least create a cozy interim solution with a few simple steps, and that was all I was looking for at first. But what came next is typical for all such projects. You knock off a small piece of plaster here and lift the floorboards up there for the sake of interest, and suddenly you're in the middle of the first extensive work. And the more you uncover, the more you want to renew. And then comes a point at which you realize that you have already changed so much that you can no longer go back to the minimal solution. So in 3 months I tore out everything that I didn't see as legitimate part of the house. Then I swept up clean, documented the condition, and started to think a bit. Everyone says you are lost without professional advice. However, I did not agree with the professional advice I received, and therefore had to develop my own solutions. That was because nobody could imagine saving anything of this shabby structure. That was not entirely unfounded, as the house was, as the old people in the village put it, built by trampling down the nettles and laying a few stones on the ground. According to my research, the house was built around 1800 as a home and workshop for a shoemaker. So not from wealthy farmers, but from a rather poor craftsman. You could feel the need to save money in all parts of the house. So I had to proceed cautiously. But after some time you notice that it is worthwhile to think deep into the old structure from a technical point of view. After all, the house was built with reliable traditional methods and had a clear structural design. The window openings are neatly beveled into the 40 cm thick brick walls. On top of the walls there are 3 longitudinal beams in relation to the ridge direction, then the ceiling beams, or floor joists for the upper floor. Then a layer of floor paneling. The 3 openings in it are cut out for the stairs, the smoke hood of the kitchen, and a passage for warm air from the living room to the bedroom. Then the upper floor framework in the longitudinal direction, and in between the framework of the gable walls. Inside there are further walls to make 2 different sized chambers. All interior walls are organically integrated into the framework. The top plates of the 3 longitudinal walls also form the support for the next ceiling beams. These are at the same time the tie beams of the traditional triangular roof trusses. Additional longitudinal timbers, which also are integrated into the gable walls, run through the attic. They are braced diagonally on the post. The rafters of the triangular roof are connected with collar beams that rest on the longitudinal beams. Then, on top of the rafters, the battens with plain tiles. Originally, the house was a twin house of identical design. To the west it continued for another 8.5 meters, but this part was replaced by a new building around 1900. Located on the edge of the village at the time, the house stood nearby a small creek that came down from the nearby village pond. Following a suggestion, I started the restoration at the bottom of the house and worked my way up. The first problem was the foundation. Of course, if the house had stood quite well for 200 years without any foundation, you can also leave it that way. But the ground floor is deeper than the street level directly in front of the house, so sealing the walls against water was necessary, and that required at least some simple foundation. I came up with a method that allowed me to dig out a small part from the inside, put in concrete, and close the gap to the remaining wall. The walls got a concrete base with an L-shaped cross-section. Its vertical part helped me with the sealing to the outside and stiffened the thing perfectly without me having to dig far down. In the middle of the wall I even put some styrofoam. The hard, modern plaster on the outside held the outer shell of the brick wall together so that only a few bricks fell down. With the inner shell poorly connected to the outside, it was way more difficult. Especially under the windows, everything usually came down. This was because the builders of the house used very bad bricks from demolitions. 90% were half stones. When I was dismantling the walls, I noticed some rounded stones whose origin was a mystery to me at first. But I found exactly these stones built into the remains of the Ulm city fortifications from the 17th century. After some research, everything became clear. When Napoleon's troops took the city of Ulm in 1801, the demolition of the city's fortress had been ordered. Many farmers were forced to work here. The stone material was then sold at different prices depending on the quality. A short time later, the house had to do with Napoleon's war again, when the French troops camped in the village before the Battle of Oberelchingen in 1805. A French soldier lost this small hollow ball in our garden, which can be used as an early form of the hand grenade or as a bomb for one small mortar. But back to the restoration. The many digging work was hard. Above all, I didn't want to chop wildly into the ground in order not to lose the existing soil pressure from the previous load. But then I had given all the walls a foundation and I had leveled the ground in between. Now all the foundations were connected to form a large floor slab by installing 8 cubic meters of concrete. Of course, I placed all kinds of cables and pipes in the base plate. Pouring in the concrete was exciting. At a certain point, there is no turning back, and you have to work hard to level out the concrete in time. For upstairs, I had already planned ahead. Since the walls were partly at risk of tipping over, I thought of an additional concrete skeleton in vertical slots in the inner wall shell. It looks a bit too complicated, but I wanted a reliable but invisible reinforcement of the walls. The half-timbered wall in the upper floor was only 16 centimeters thick and in a very poor condition. I made a concrete beam directly on top of the inner shell of the ground floor wall. That was also practical for attaching the floor joists underneath them. In the upper floor, we built an additional inner wall, again with reused material. The new inner wall is a good solution in many ways. It serves for stiffening and for noise protection, stores some heat in winter, and enables installations to be hidden. It was also practical that I could at first leave the outer framework as it was and get everything in order from the inside. I wanted to move the windows back to their old positions in the framework, so the windows openings of the inner wall didn't match the windows outside at first, which seemed a bit like I didn't know what I was doing. Then the house was stable again from the foundation to the eaves. From the outside, little of all the work was visible. Another video is about what still had to be done there.